So I freaking love Metroid. I mean, for many of us in our 30s and 40s, it's one of Nintendo's strongest series from a gameplay perspective. And yet, its best-selling game sold just north of 3 million copies. How is a series that inspired an entire genre of video games never had a game sell 10 or even 5 million copies? I mean, consider this. Animal Crossing New Horizons sold 48 million copies on the Nintendo Switch. Breath of the Wild was around 33 million, Super Mario Odyssey about 29.5 million. Those games haven't just sold more than Metroid's best, they've sold more than the entire Metroid franchise combined. It's not just Mario, Pokemon, and Zelda. Even Kirby, Donkey Kong, and Splatoon, heck, even Luigi's Mansion are destroying Metroid's numbers. Honestly, when I look at it like this, I'm surprised Dread actually happened, and we're lucky that Prime 4 is still happening after its troubled development history. But I want to understand why. Why is it that Metroid has consistently delivered with critics and delivered innovative gameplay, but never quite broke out when it comes to massive mainstream success? And then I want us to consider if Metroid Prime 4 Beyond can finally be the one to break this cycle. To do both of those things, we need to go back to the beginning. The original Metroid released in Japan on the Nintendo Entertainment System in August of 1986, and then a year later in North America. It was a groundbreaking action-adventure game where players controlled a bounty hunter by the name of Samus Aran. Its non-linear exploration, atmospheric design, and hidden secrets laid the foundation for the entire Metroidvania genre. Right from the jump, it was clear that Metroid set out to do something very different compared to Mario and Zelda. Boot up the original Super Mario Bros. And you're instantly met with the iconic theme song, colorful visuals, and only one way to move. Metroid opens up with a much more somber tone, dark color palette, and it also gives you the ability to move left or right. A small but very important difference compared to Mario. Not only can Samus jump, she can also fire her arm cannon. Within seconds, if you go to the left that is, you'll get the Morph Ball upgrade, which immediately gives you a new ability that alters how you can move through the world around you. Then in the very next room, Metroid gives you a hint of something more, a hint of an area that's out of reach. And this of course helps to set the stage for the whole backtracking mechanic, where you return to previous areas, but now you have new abilities that help you to get into areas you couldn't before. Now the original Legend of Zelda, like Mario, brings the colorful visuals, but it adds a much more adventurous tone. Where Metroid wants you to embrace the sense of isolation, the very first character you meet in Zelda warns that it's dangerous to go alone. Of course, all of this was intentional with all three games. Yoshio Sakamoto, a key designer and director for Metroid, has explicitly cited Ridley Scott's film Alien as a major influence on the series. Metroid's atmosphere, sparse storytelling, and sense of solitude evoke a lot of the same tension and dread present in the movie. And of course, there's the female protagonist. Now, in addition to the overall tone, the original Metroid wasn't an easy game. Even so, it would go on to sell a respectable 2.7 million copies, which puts it as the 18th best-selling NES game. Now, it's hard to really think about those numbers without a bit more context. So Mario and Zelda sold much better, of course, which isn't much of a surprise. But what did surprise me is that even games like Excitebike, Golf, Kung Fu, and Punch-Out all sold more than the Metroid. So even here, right from the beginning, we're seeing a problem with Metroid start to emerge. It's a quality game, but one that only appeals to a smaller subset of Nintendo's much larger audience. And unfortunately, the problem will only get worse as we go on. In fact, Super Metroid would far surpass the original in terms of gameplay. The dark, moody atmosphere, sense of isolation, and backtracking through previous areas remained. But this new title for the Super Nintendo also introduced significant improvements, which include a refined control scheme, new abilities, an in-game map and objective markers this time, as well as vastly improved graphics. All of these enhancements made Super Metroid a landmark title. Even today, many consider it to be one of the best games of all time. Even with all these improvements though, and releasing on a popular home console, Super Metroid only sold 1.4 million copies, barely half of what the original sold. That's good for the 34th best-selling Super Nintendo game, which puts Super Metroid behind both Donkey Kong games as well as Kirby Superstar, Star Fox, even Mario Paint outsold Super Metroid. Now, the series did make an appearance on the original Game Boy as well, with Metroid 2: Return of Samus. This one was somewhat held back by the technical limitations of the Game Boy, but Nintendo still managed to improve on the first game and deliver something that critics and fans enjoyed once again. It actually sold 1.7 million copies, making it the 32nd best-selling Game Boy game. At this point, it's clear that something was just off with Metroid, and Nintendo, of course, they had to have seen this. Another thing you have to keep in mind is that the gaming landscape of the late 80s and early 90s was very different from the one that we have today. In this specific period, between the release of the Super Nintendo in 1990 and and the Nintendo 64 in 1996, well, it's not hyperbole at all to say that it fundamentally changed the gaming industry forever. The story of that brutal breakup between Nintendo and Sony has been well documented over the years. It led to Sony making the original PlayStation and beating Nintendo to the market. Combine that with Sony's developer-friendly policies and cheaper production costs thanks to going with CDs over cartridges, it's easy to see why third parties flooded the PlayStation with support. Didn't you have all those gamers who grew up playing Mario and Zelda? Well, now they're getting older. They were looking for fresh gaming experiences with deeper stories and more mature themes to match their interests. All of this was a perfect storm for Sony. Exclusive games like Final Fantasy VII, Tomb Raider, Gran Turismo, Resident Evil, and Metal Gear Solid dominated the sales charts. The PlayStation would go on to sell over 100 million units, making it one of the best-selling consoles of all time and far surpassing the N64's 32 million. This specific moment in history could have been the perfect time for Metroid to shine. The perfect opportunity for Nintendo to show players that, hey, we can make those types of games too. I mean, even Nintendo gamers were showing interest in darker, more realistic titles this generation. GoldenEye 007 sold 8 million copies, making it the third best-selling N64 game. You also had Mario and Zelda making the jump to 3D in epic fashion and delivering some of the best games ever made. And hey, speaking of Zelda, both Ocarina of Time and especially Majora's Mask took the series in a darker direction and still found critical and commercial success. We also got the original Perfect Dark this generation, which sold 2.5 million copies. And keep in mind, that was even as an M-rated title exclusive to the N64. Metroid, though, it went completely dark this generation. Clearly, Nintendo was trying to figure out what to do with the franchise. Games were starting to get the 3D treatment and becoming more realistic than ever before. The industry was also growing like never before. Darker, more mature games were becoming the norm. Now, Nintendo wasn't blind to this. They clearly saw this shift and tried to plan accordingly for the next generation. Metroid Prime would release on the Nintendo GameCube in November of 2002, no longer as a 2D side-scroller, but as a first-person adventure, as Nintendo called it. Retro Studios managed to take so many of the elements that fans loved from the 2D installments and translate them perfectly into 3D. While it was initially met with a lot of skepticism, Metroid Prime received massive praise from fans and critics alike. It was actually my introduction to the Metroid series, and I'll never forget picking up my copy of EGM, which I actually still have to this day. I've kept it all these years, the issue that featured the Metroid Prime review, because I'll never forget that moment when I flipped to the review section and saw not one, not two, but 3 tents. The specific review that always stuck out in my mind is the one from Mark McDonald, which had this iconic line, quote, "It's like the best title from 6 years in the future fell through a time warp." It wasn't just Metroid Prime though. Nintendo was bringing Metroid back in a big way. They even released Metroid Fusion on the Game Boy Advance the exact same day as Metroid Prime here in North America. Like Prime, Fusion received copious praise from critics and fans. So finally, Nintendo had a true mega hit with Metroid Prime, right? Well, not so much actually. Fusion sold a respectable 1.6 million copies on the GBA, but it still lagged behind other Nintendo franchises. Mario and Zelda, of course, but also Kirby and Donkey Kong, even Wario and new hits like Golden Sun came out ahead of Fusion on the GBA. Now, to its credit, Metroid Prime did sell well, 2.8 million copies, which made it the 5th best-selling GameCube game of all time, actually just ahead of Animal Crossing. With the GameCube, though, Nintendo had a much bigger problem on their hands: the PlayStation 2. Sony once again beat everyone to the punch, and honestly, it took all the momentum of the PS1 and carried it right into the launch of the PS2. With a built-in DVD player, cutting-edge 3D graphics, and more hit titles from franchises like Gran Turismo, Metal Gear Solid, and a little-known series called Grand Theft Auto, the PS2 dominated. This is also the generation when Microsoft entered the home console race with the Xbox. The GameCube ended up selling around 22 million units, just behind the Xbox's 24 million, and a very distant third to the PS2's 160 million. Now, to their credit, Nintendo clearly saw something in Retro Studios and what they had done with Metroid Prime. Just 2 years after the original, they released Metroid Prime 2 Echoes. It was yet another critical success, but sales lagged far behind the original. They would then release a remake of the original Metroid in 2004 on the Game Boy Advance with Metroid Zero Mission. Again, this reviewed well, but sold just shy of 800,000 copies. They tried releasing Metroid Prime Hunters on the DS, even packing it in as a free demo when the handheld launched. This game took place between Prime 1 and Echoes, but it focused more on multiplayer modes, even including Wi-Fi and voice chat. Now, Hunters, even though it didn't quite get the same level of critical acclaim as Prime, it reviewed well, but at the same time, it wasn't that core Metroid experience. Hunters sold just over 1 million copies. Oh, and I know some of you out there love Metroid Prime Pinball. Sales estimates put its numbers at less than 250,000 copies sold. Time and time again though, no matter the circumstances and no matter how well these games reviewed, they just couldn't quite break out the way that so many other Nintendo franchises did year after year. So what about Metroid Prime 3 Corruption? It was the conclusion to the Prime trilogy, but more importantly, it released on the Wii instead of the GameCube. And where the GameCube was largely a commercial disappointment, the Wii was a cultural phenomenon. Thanks to its innovative motion controls and titles like Wii Sports, it vaulted Nintendo into the mainstream like they'd never been before, at least with a home console. The Wii would go on to sell more than 101 million units, while the DS sold 154 million. Nintendo's hardware was hotter than ever before. Even with so much momentum, Corruption sold just shy of 1.5 million copies. That was good for the 48th best-selling title on the Wii. And then came Metroid Other M in 2010, Nintendo's attempt to give the series a bit of a shakeup. They partnered with Team Ninja and had them try to blend 3D gameplay with classic 2D perspectives. They also tried to do more in terms of story and character when compared to the previous Metroid games. The results were not great. Other M was riddled with controversial story choices, restrictive gameplay mechanics, and a departure from what fans loved about Samus as a character. It sold less than 1 million copies and very nearly killed the franchise. What followed was just more years of silence. Years where fans wondered if Metroid was truly dead. Surely by 2016, for Metroid's 30th anniversary, Nintendo would have something for longtime fans, right? Well, the good news is that the news actually came a year earlier in 2015. Nintendo did announce a new Metroid game, but it wasn't what anyone expected. Metroid Prime Federation Force was a cooperative multiplayer game for the 3DS. Oh, and Samus wasn't even the main character. Instead, you played as generic Galactic Federation Marines. Unsurprisingly, this didn't go over well with just about anyone. The reveal trailer became one of the most disliked Nintendo videos ever, with fans even creating petitions demanding its cancellation. Now, Other M actually saw some decent review scores, but Federation Force pretty much bombed. It had a 64 Metacritic rating and an even lower score from users. Sales reflected that frustration, with the game moving fewer than 150,000 copies worldwide. At this point, it felt like Nintendo had fundamentally misunderstood what most people had loved about Metroid. Here, they were focusing more on multiplayer mechanics over the solitary exploration that had defined the series. To make it all even worse, Nintendo all but ignored Metroid's 30th anniversary. In fact, they even canceled a fan-made project to try and commemorate the 30th anniversary. In 2016, that very same year that Federation Force disappointed fans, a group of dedicated Metroid enthusiasts released another Metroid 2 remake, or AM2R. This fan-made project completely reimagined the original Game Boy sequel with modern visuals and gameplay. Nintendo, of course, would shut down AM2R with a DMCA takedown, but then surprised everyone at E3 2017 by announcing Metroid Samus Returns. This was their own official remake of Metroid 2, developed by Mercury Steam. Without a doubt, Samus Returns was a step in the right direction. Classic 2D Metroid gameplay with modern polish, new abilities like the melee counter, and gorgeous visuals that pushed the 3DS to its limits. Critics praised it as a return to form, and it felt like Nintendo finally understood what made Metroid special after all. But the sales? Just over 1.3 million copies. Better than recent entries, sure, but still nowhere near Nintendo's other major franchises. Now by this point, the 3DS was nearing the end of its life cycle, and all eyes were on the Switch as the next big thing for Nintendo. Fast forward to E3 2021 when they dropped a bombshell that nobody saw coming. Metroid Dread, a completely new 2D Metroid game, was coming to the Nintendo Switch. Now, we don't have near enough time in this video to go over the full history of all the leaks and all the rumors for Metroid Dread over the years, but let's just say the reaction to the announcement of Dread was electric. The die-hard Metroid fans were more optimistic about the series than they'd been in a very long time. And to make it even better, Metroid Dread, it absolutely delivered. It was incredibly well received by fans and critics. That, combined with the mega popularity of the Switch, was enough to propel Metroid Dread to over 3 million in sales, a first for the series, which also makes it the best-selling Metroid game of all time. Now, I don't want to make it sound like selling 3 million copies of a game is bad. It's definitely not. I mean, there are many developers who would absolutely love for their game to sell 3 million copies, but it just feels like, for Metroid, a series that's been around for this long and inspired so many other games, it would have to be able to sell more than 3 million copies, right? I mean, titles like 1-2 Switch sold 3.7 million copies. Pikmin 4 sold 3.5 million. Even Yoshi's Crafted World outsold Metroid Dread. Even so, despite all of this, Nintendo wasn't done with Metroid. In February 2023, during a routine Nintendo Direct, they casually announced that the long-rumored Metroid Prime Remastered was available immediately on the Nintendo Switch. Now, this wasn't just a port, it was a complete visual overhaul. Updated textures, improved lighting, modernized controls that worked with both traditional and motion controls. Retro Studios had taken their GameCube masterpiece and made it feel like the original, but with all the modern polish fans wanted to see. Prime Remastered reminded everyone why the Prime series was so special to begin with, and that it still largely holds up all these years later. It also helped build anticipation for Prime 4 while introducing a new generation of Switch owners to the 3D Metroid experience. Now, we haven't gotten official sales numbers since 2023, but we do know that it's sold at least 1.3 million copies and very likely more. So at least with Dread and the remaster of Prime, we're starting to see things trend in the right direction. Dare I say Metroid even has a little bit of momentum on its side right now. Aside from a few duds along the way, Metroid has mostly delivered in a big way in terms of influential design, innovative gameplay, and critical acclaim. But that big-time commercial success, consistently missing, even when Nintendo seemed to finally get things right with Dread and Prime Remastered. And I know I've been throwing a lot of numbers out in this video, but just to put this in a modern day perspective, let's take a look at Hollow Knight for a moment. This indie game takes clear inspiration from the Metroidvania genre, proving that the formula works. Team Cherry just recently announced that they've surpassed 15 million in sales, which of course far surpasses even Metroid Dread, the best-selling Metroid game. So now we've reached the all-important question of why. Why has Metroid been a consistently genre-defining series but never had a game that's even managed to sell 4 million copies? Allow me to present to you what I think are the 3 biggest reasons why. Problem number 1. Nintendo built their empire on family-friendly, colorful experiences. Experiences that parents feel comfortable buying for their kids. Metroid is dark and isolated with a gameplay loop that would frustrate most younger audiences. Metroid leans into that isolation of space, but it's always stopped short of being as dark as something like Dead Space, which is yet another title that definitely has a bit of Metroid in its DNA. This creates a fundamental marketing challenge for Nintendo. It just doesn't fit their core brand identity. Now with Mario, Donkey Kong, Kirby, and even recent titles like Animal Crossing and Splatoon, the difference in tone and target audience is incredibly obvious. At the same time, Metroid has always stopped short of being a survival horror game. It's not Dead Space, it's not Resident Evil. It straddles the line with its tone and themes, which leaves it stuck somewhere in the middle. Now, I could think of at least one Nintendo title that's featured plenty of dark themes over the years and still managed to become a mainstream hit. Somehow, The Legend of Zelda makes all of this work. It can get serious, but always maintains that fantasy adventure appeal. Its gameplay loop is even more open-ended than Metroid, but there's one key difference, and this leads me to problem number 2. Nintendo's biggest successes are built around iconic, relatable characters. Mario is expressive and charming. You see his personality in every jump and victory celebration. Pikachu is adorable and instantly lovable. Even when Link doesn't speak, he's surrounded by memorable characters like Zelda, Ganondorf, and quirky NPCs that all bring personality to the world. This is actually how Zelda manages to succeed despite having some darker themes. Majora's Mask deals with death and the apocalypse, but you're never truly alone. There's always Navi, or Zelda herself providing companionship and personality. Link may be silent, but his world is full of memorable faces and voices. Metroid, on the other hand, deliberately isolates you. Samus spends most of her adventures in full armor with no facial expressions visible, except for that really cool effect in Metroid Prime. When she does interact with other characters, it's minimal, usually just mission briefings or scan logs. Of course, the one time Nintendo did try to do a little more with the story and Samus as a character, it kind of missed the mark entirely. The loneliness and atmosphere, of course, it's all intentional, but this also makes the series less emotionally engaging for mainstream audiences. Kids don't see Samus and think, I want to be her, the way they do with Mario, Link, Zelda, or even a character like Princess Peach. Even in spite of these 2 problems though, Nintendo might have still been able to have a true mega hit with Metroid, if not for problem number 3. You see, Metroid missed the most important shift in gaming history. In the mid-90s, gaming was growing up. Sony entered with the PlayStation, targeting older audiences with mature experiences like Resident Evil, Metal Gear Solid, and Final Fantasy. This was the moment when mature gaming went mainstream. And where was Metroid during this crucial transition? Completely absent. Nintendo chose not to make a Metroid game for the N64, focusing instead on keeping their franchises family-friendly. While Sony was capturing teenage and adult gamers with darker, more sophisticated experiences, Nintendo doubled down on the colorful, all-ages entertainment. And don't get me wrong, it has served the company incredibly well, but not so much Metroid as a franchise. By the time that Prime released in 2002, it was just way too late. PS2 had already locked down the mature gaming market. The hardcore, mature audience that would naturally gravitate toward Metroid, they were already on PlayStation playing Grand Theft Auto, Metal Gear, and Resident Evil. And here's the kicker. We know now that there's a massive audience for Metroid-style experiences. just not on Nintendo platforms. Hollow Knight has sold over 15 million copies across PC and other consoles. The Ori series has surpassed 15 million with its first 2 games. Even a hyper-niche title like Returnal, a title that doesn't have near the brand recognition as Metroid, managed to sell over 1.1 million copies across PS5 and PC. And that was even considered somewhat of a disappointment. Of course, you also have Elden Ring, which had a massive mainstream success, proving that challenging, atmospheric games can go mainstream when they're on the right platforms. You see, these platforms have audiences that expect and even actively seek out mature, complex gaming experiences. Nintendo's core audience as a whole simply isn't looking for what Metroid offers. And all of this takes us to the present day. What about Metroid Prime 4? Can it finally be the Metroid game to truly break out? And if it doesn't, is it the end of Metroid as we know it? Well, first, let's look at the current state of the franchise. While Dread and Prime Remastered didn't set the world on fire in terms of sales, they both sold well enough to keep me optimistic. You could make a good argument that the environment has never been better for a Metroid game to succeed. And fortunately, it has nothing to do with Nintendo changing what Metroid is at its core. Now, as I think about this, part of me really wishes that they hadn't went with Metroid Prime 4 Beyond as a title, because I think it's just like a psychological thing where some people will feel like, oh, I haven't played the first 3 games, so I'm not going to play Beyond. I kind of wish instead they would have went with like Metroid Beyond and did something more like what God of War did in 2018, sort of a soft reboot of the franchise that might help bring in new people. Prime 4 will launch simultaneously on both the Switch and the new Switch 2. So right away, Nintendo is tapping into the massive install base of the Switch while also giving early adopters of the new hardware a chance to play the game on a much more capable system. We can also look at Cyberpunk 2077, which has been one of the best-selling games on Switch 2 so far. Perhaps that's a good sign there's a more mature audience ready and willing to give Metroid a chance this go-round. Third parties as a whole are also lining up to support the Switch 2, even with mature titles like Cyberpunk, Borderlands, and Elden Ring. Perhaps those third-party devs are seeing signs that Nintendo's audience is ready and willing to embrace more mature content when it's of high quality. Make no mistake though, Metroid Prime 4 isn't just another sequel. It's proof that in an industry obsessed with mass appeal, there's still room for those games that speak to something deeper. Games that trust you to get lost, to feel overwhelmed, to emerge stronger. And as I've been researching for this video and thinking about all of my personal experiences with Metroid, I realize it's not even just about the genre that Metroid has created. It's about a philosophy that believes deep and thorough exploration should be rewarded, that atmosphere can be a character of itself and have a huge impact on gameplay mechanics. So yes, Metroid probably shouldn't exist as a Nintendo franchise, but at least coming from this one fan, I'm so very thankful that it does. And if you are someone who's watched all the way to the end of this video and you've never experienced any of the Metroid series before, then take this as a sign that now is the time. As always, thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon.